Okay, good afternoon. So as you know, I've just returned from a 10-day trip to Gallipoli in the Gulf States. It was a huge privilege to lead our country's official delegation to Gallipoli to mark the centenary of the Anzac landings. It was incredibly moving to stand on the ground where more than 2,700 New Zealanders lost their lives, and it was an experience I'll never forget. My visit to the Gulf States was an opportunity to strengthen and grow trade and business links. New Zealand has a lot to offer the Gulf region, and a number of our businesses already have a good presence in this market. In fact, it was pretty impressive to visit a local supermarket in Dubai and see so many Kiwi brands on the shelves. I was proud to lead an 18-strong business delegation with some of New Zealand's top performing companies, including Silverfern Farms, Tegel, Fonterra and Orion Health. Enormous opportunities lie in these wealthy countries for a broad range of New Zealand industries, from agriculture to education services. And while trading relationships with the Gulf States will take time to build, I'm happy with the progress being made. It was extremely important to meet leaders in Dubai, Abu Dhabi, Saudi and Kuwait face to face, and I'm much more positive about the prospect of concluding the free trade agreement with the Gulf Cooperation Council given the response that we got. In just over 2 weeks, Bill English will deliver the government's 7th budget. It will be delivered in the context of a strong and growing economy and improving government finances. Since we took office in 2008, New Zealand has made significant progress. Last year we were one of the fastest growing developed economies in the world. We remain on track for further solid growth over the next few years. This growth is supporting tens of thousands of new jobs each year, and our economy is growing, allowing wages to rise faster than inflation. Add to that very low inflation, which is helping to keep interest rates lower for longer, and we have a positive environment for households and businesses. The budget will build on that progress and set out some important next steps in the government's overall program, but the very factors that are helping households and businesses get ahead are making aspects of the government's finances more challenging. The combination of low inflation, low interest rates and lower dairy prices is slowing growth in the government revenue. Treasury now expects the government will collect $4.5 billion less over the next 4 years than it forecast just a year ago. Slower revenue growth means getting to surplus may take a little longer than expected, but there's no question we're heading towards a surplus, which means we can start repaying debt. As Bill put it on Friday, if you set out to lose 10 kgs and by the end of the year you lose 9.8, it still amounts to considerable progress. So we won't be cutting services or changing direction to try and offset the lower than expected revenue. To the contrary, we'll continue to support the most vulnerable New Zealanders and to invest more in health and education and improve public services. And we'll focus on improving our competitiveness so the economy can continue growing in the future and support more jobs and higher incomes. New Zealanders have come to expect these kinds of considered and sensible policies from the government. We won't be changing that approach, but over the next couple of weeks we'll make a few pre-budget announcements as we usually do in the lead up to the budget itself. You may be interested to note the Flag Consideration Panel will launch its engagement campaign tomorrow. I welcome this next step in the process. The campaign itself has been devised by the independent panel. Ministers have had no role in it. We said that out of respect, the public engagement process won't start till the Gallipoli commemorations were over, and that's what we've done. I'm looking forward to seeing the flag suggestions that come forward from the public, and I'm confident people will take the opportunity to have their say. But as I've said before, in the end I'll have one vote in each referendum, just like any other New Zealander on the electoral roll. Finally, I'm looking forward to welcoming Prince Harry to New Zealand on Saturday in his first visit to New Zealand. The Prince is asked to meet a wide range of New Zealanders, so his program has been designed with that in mind, and will soon visit 6 New Zealand centres. I'm confident Prince Harry will have a great time here, and I'll encourage all New Zealanders to pop along and get a chance to see him. This week in the House we intend to make progress on a number of bills, including the New Zealand Business Number Bill and the Social Assistance Bill, and also to note Wednesday as a Members' Day. Finally, in terms of my own activities this week, I'm in Wellington today, tomorrow and Wednesday. On Thursday and Friday I'm in the Taupo electorate. On Saturday we're back in Wellington for Prince Harry's arrival before heading to Ashburton for the National Party Mainland Conference. Questions?
Labour says there's a clear conflict of interest in the case of the minister's brother who's facing indecent assault charges. Is there a conflict of interest or perceived conflict of interest?
No. The advice I've had is that there is not. We were first made aware of the issue on April the 1st. We took advice on that day, and the advice on that day was that there is no conflict. I think sort of further deeper advice was even sought, and that continued to confirm the position.
What about a perception? Are you worried about a perception of a conflict of interest?
Well, there'll always be people that might be able to claim that case, but we work on the best advice we can get, and the best advice supports the stance I've taken.
So how are you managing that? Because the Cabinet Manual sets out a few things that you can do. How are you managing perceived conflict?
In line with the Cabinet Manual.
So what are you doing?
Well, we're doing it in line with the Cabinet Manual.
So have other ministers taken over some of the minister?
No, there's been no change in ministerial delegations.
So did you get your advice from the Cabinet Office?
Yes.
And anyone else?
Yes, but I'm not in a position to say that.
But private advice, you mean?
Well, the Cabinet Office in providing advice to me sought other advice that I'm not in a position to comment on, but I'm quite confident the position is correctly assessed and thorough.
How did you come to the decision that not a action needed to be taken?
On the basis of the advice I received on both April the 1st and subsequent to that.
You said that you'd asked for some deeper advice. Can you tell us what you mean?
I can't, unfortunately, no.
Will the minister still be receiving all official documents in his or her capacity as minister?
As appropriate, yes.
So some may be held back.
Maybe if there was a conflict of interest, but as said, conflicts of interest are not uncommon. They're well and truly catered for in the Cabinet Manual, and providing they're dealt with appropriately, ministers all the time manage conflicts of interest.
Labor's also drawing parallels with the Mike Sabin case, the fact that he wasn't stood down from the Law and Order Select Committee. Are you worried that there could be a perception of a trend here that you're going soft on MPs?
No, I'm quite comfortable with the way I handled that position as well.
Prime Minister, why have you taken legal advice over the ponytail business?
Oh, look, only because, as you're aware, someone's filed a private prosecution, so I'm required to obviously do that.
Are you worried about that?
No,
Who's paying for the advice?
I will be.
You're paying in with capacity as a man, not Prime Minister.
No, I'm personal best.
Would you be concerned that the waitress also makes a complaint?
Look, I just don't really have anything else to say about it. It's been a well-traversed track over the last couple of weeks. You'll appreciate I've made lots of public comments, but that's really all I've got to say. Just if there are any other comments to what I previously said.
Have you sought any advice in the instance of her taking any legal action?
As I said, that's all I've got to say on the matter.
Prime Minister, the Office of the Ombudsman are to investigate police over the decision not to disclose whether yourself and the Minister of Police were briefed on a no surprises briefing about the investigation into Mike Sabin. Do you support that investigation?
Absolutely. Well and truly entitled to do that. I stand by the statements I've publicly made on that, which was the first I was advised was the 1st of December, I think it was last year.
So you're fully confident an investigation won't pull out any information that contradicts previous positions?
I am, yeah.
With regard to Nick Smith and your capacity as Minister for Ministerial Services, why does he get a accommodation payment when he's living in a flat in Bowen House?
I don't, it's a slightly complicated position. I don't claim to have all of the absolute ins and outs of it, but the advice I've had is that he is adhering to the rules as set down by both Parliamentary Services and Ministerial Services. My understanding is he has an apartment that is covered under his ministerial allowance. He does have a spare room, and I think the rules do allow for somebody to let a family or friend member stay there, and that's what he's done at no charge.
I'm more interested in the fact that it's a property that is administered by Parliamentary Services and is technically owned by the taxpayer. What makes that property different, say, to the Crown properties occupied by yourself, Stephen Joyce?
Well, one's owned by the Crown and one's leased by the Crown.
So the lease is the reason for the payment?
I don't think, my understanding, I think there wasn't a payment, but you'd have to check with his office.
Sorry, does he pay rent?
I think Felix, you have to ask him, was referring to the fact that Nick had a sort of a friend, if you like, or a person staying in his accommodation but didn't charge him any rent, and I think he's entitled to do that under the rules.
Well, I was more actually interested in the fact that he gets paid in accommodation expenses, and the recent declarations show that.
Yep.
And I'm just curious as to why he gets an accommodation expense when he's living in an apartment that's technically already taxpayer funded. Because you'd be paying less on that apartment regardless of what was occupied.
I don't know, you'd have to ask his office out, I don't have that level of detail.
In Hobsonville, for the affordable homes,
Sorry, which bill?
Hobsonville.
Oh, you're in Hobsonville, yeah.
Homes house. The top price has gone up from $485 to $550.
Yeah.
Do you still consider that as an affordable home for?
Well, I think from memory, under the Home Start program, it's 550,000 or less. There's a range of properties at Hobsonville. I mean, it's, as I understand it, the single largest housing development in Australasia. So there's a range of properties there from millions of dollars down to obviously much cheaper ones. But I think there are plenty of the experience I've had going out there. A lot of first home buyers and young couples buying a property there.
So they put it down to rising building costs. I mean, would you be concerned if that carried on and those houses continued to become more expensive?
Well, clearly the government is doing everything it can to try and reduce those building costs, and that's some of the steps you've seen us take around all sorts of imported duties and the likes reflect that. So yes, of course we're trying to do that. I mean, just looking at the latest CPI data, I don't think the data supported that there was exponential growth in building costs. From the top of my head, I think it was around 5%. I think to check it, but across sort of builds around the country, land seems to be the bigger issue, and the release of that land. And that's really the issue we've been focusing on through special housing areas.
So do you think these are reasonable then, given that, I mean, it's higher than the 5%?
Would depend on the property. There really is just such a massive range there. I wouldn't really want to comment.
Does the ponytail business come up at Cabinet at all?
No,
None of your ministers made any reference to it.
no,
What about any of the caucus?
no.
Are you worried about your wife being called as a witness?
Look, I just got no other comments to make on that issue. Thanks.
The Australian Federal Police has come out saying that you passing on information to Indonesian authorities could have led to the execution of the Bali 9 duo last week. What's New Zealand's policy on providing information about Kiwis to foreign police that could lead to the execution?
You'd have to put that to the police minister. I don't have an answer to that.
I don't think they've been getting back to us. But do you know if it's up to in New Zealand? If it's
I
up to
really
police?
don't have any details on that.
Do you know if New Zealand's ever withheld information from foreign authorities?
Don't have any details on that, sorry.
Just on your comments on government revenues, you say the surplus could be delayed. The market seems to think that it won't get there this year anyway, and you're talking about another year of deficit.
No, I'm talking about this budget year.
And so you've given up.
Well, there's no
on the
guarantees.
surplus.
Whatever the number that happens on budget day, that's in itself still a forecast. You've got to remember, we don't actually know the numbers, I think, until ultimately when the final revenue comes in. From memory, that's October, but I might have to check that.
But you expect surplus next year.
We
come
would,
on,
yeah.
mate.
Are you still committed to tax cuts before the 2017 election?
Well, the Minister of Finance, I think, indicated on Friday when he gave his speech that obviously conditions are difficult, but at the moment that's what they're working on.
Just on the flag, support for that public support that seems to be waning, would you consider changing the way that referendum is being held or changing any part of that?
No, I mean, look, if you think about the flag referendum and this whole process, this isn't really something new. I mean, the changing of the flag's been an issue that's been debated for at least 25 years. And if you go and look in the media, there's been endless commentary and opinion pieces written about why we should change our flag. I actually think there's very strong rationale for doing that. I wouldn't take too much out of one poll that's sort of done around sort of Anzac Day. I think that's going to have some impact on that data, and I wouldn't read too much into it until people get a sense of what an alternative might look like. So you have to go through a process. I think once we've gone through that process, New Zealanders will vote. It's always going to be a challenging issue, but I think when New Zealanders get a chance to consider the alternative and consider the merits of the argument, it's eminently possible we'll get over the line.
Why not just have a yes-no referendum?
Because a yes-no referendum doesn't actually take you very far, because a whole lot of people who would vote yes will only vote yes if they know what they're moving to.
Are you planning a reshuffle in the weeks following the budget?
No, I haven't got one planned.
There was comments by Judith Collins at the weekend about how she'd like to drop back. Is that, would like to be back in cabinet?
Well, I think that's just a standing position. I don't think she's working on any sort of particular information. I think she's just simply making the point she'd like to return to cabinet.
Is that likely to happen by the end of the year? Or?
I don't know. I said when Justice Chisholm's report came out that potentially cleared the pathway back for her. So a reason why she couldn't come back to cabinet, but that if a vacancy presented itself, she'd have to be considered along with other contenders, and there are other contenders, so we'd need to consider all of that.
When do you anticipate that next vacancy coming up?
Don't know.
Just turning back to Indonesia, the Prime Minister flagged that he's discussing any further measures to support Australia with you. Would you consider any further measures, such as giving one ambassador or anything like that?
We're not intending to withdraw our ambassador. We understand and have great sympathy for the issue that Australia has faced, but in the end it's not a New Zealander, and if we withdrew our ambassador because a national of another country was subjected to their law, as much as we are opposed to the death penalty, then you can make the case that we would be withdrawing ambassador investors from quite a number of countries, so we're not intending to do that.
Any other measures at all that you consider?
Nothing I've been advised of.
What about Anthony de Malmonte, if that comes there with him, would you look at withdrawing that investment?
Look, other than the comments I've previously made, I really haven't got a lot to add here. I think I may stand corrected, but the advice I was given was his lawyer himself, or Mr. de Malmonte's lawyer, has made the point publicly that he doesn't want the government intervening in the process, and I think we'd want to respect that.
On Auckland house prices, Victoria has just announced plans for a new foreign buyers tax. Does New Zealand risk being the odd one out, maybe one that doesn't have some restrictions on foreign buying?
My understanding in Australia, there may be differences by state, but for a long period of time, Australia's, or I think a long period of time, for a reasonable period of time at least, Australia's had a position where you can buy new properties if you're a foreigner, but you can't buy existing properties. I think the changes that we saw on the weekend largely reflected that. In other words, it was more about adherence to that policy, because the Australian authorities believe that people have been going around the rules. We don't have that, but you have to say it hasn't worked terribly well anyway in Australia, has it? I mean, Sydney house prices, from what I've seen, have been rising, if not as fast, then faster than Auckland house prices. So having a restriction in that area hasn't really worked.
So
But
today,
the
then, is this tax a prudent bet then, and one that someone should look at as well?
In terms of stopping them buying existing properties?
No, the 3% tax.
Well, I might be reading it wrong, but my understanding of what they were really doing was arguing the case that there should be greater adherence and following those rules around essentially when you buy an existing property, which you're not allowed to do if you're a foreigner. I mean, in terms of sort of stamp duties and withholding taxes and the likes, Australia again has had those for a long period of time. They haven't really changed the appetite, wouldn't seem now. Doesn't mean you don't raise some revenue out of it, or at the margins it could potentially do something, I suppose. But certainly at the moment there isn't a great evidence that it's stopped foreigners wanting to buy.
This is a separate announcement from the Victorian government,
Okay.
a 3% tax on foreign buyers to raise over $300 million.
Yeah, I mean, look, if New Zealand was to do that, for starters, it wouldn't be able to exempt Australians, Japanese nationals or Mexicans, because they're already covered under the FTAs that we have. So you have to look at other buyers.
The median house price for Auckland, $809,000 in March. I mean, how much higher can it go before it's unsustainable?
Well, I don't know. I mean, in the end, house prices have clearly been rising, and the government's response to that is pretty clear, which is try and pump up the supply volume. The Reserve Bank's always looking at those issues, and you've seen the governor or deputy governor make some comments, but the bank's always looking at what response it can also have. But you do have a situation where you've got strong levels of consumer confidence, very low levels of inflation, very low interest rates. And as you probably saw on the weekend, what looks like a bit of a mortgage war already taking place. So consumers are getting access to quite a lot of capital at low prices.
And the Reserve Bank said last week they could cut rates again, so there's the risk that you see even more petrol in that fire.
Possible, but they're all the things that the bank manages, of course.
Right, Mr. what made you much more positive about achieving a free trade agreement with the Gulf states?
Well, I think nothing beats face-to-face contact, and they're certainly a culture that welcomes and responds well to that. We also got incredibly strong feedback from 3 of the 4 countries or states that we're at. So the UAE, effectively, through obviously Dubai and the United Arab Emirates, were very, very positive, as was Kuwait. Saudi, I don't think it's so much that they're not positive, but they're always just a bit more cautious. So we've talked through what the next steps are, and there's a meeting, I think, taking place sometime later in the year. It's either with debate on their side about who would actually attend it, but it's either economic ministers or foreign ministers, and that's the next opportunity they'll have to discuss the FTA.
And what are still the sticking points to get that over the line?
Nothing was clearly identified, so I think we've dealt with the issues that we had in Saudi. But it's really just about whether they want to take the next step. I mean, one thing with the FTA in the Gulf states is that tariffs there aren't high, they're 5%. So if you think about Korea, we faced tariffs up around 45% in some product lines like kiwi fruit. So they're not really high. But I just think the completion of the FTA just gives us yet another, reason for those relationships to grow and be closer together and more focus from our businesses.
Because
Well,
there's a
given they're
suggestion
not
that some of it
buying,
could just be
what- sorry.
personal, isn't it? Because
Sorry?
there's a suggestion that it could also just be a personal issue to do with a businessman who came and invested heavily here and then fell back down.
I think that issue's been dealt with. Yeah.
But given that.
How can you
not
deal with it
liable-
without dealing with the issue of promising or allowing live sheep or live exports?
Well, it's as you know, a long and been protracted debate over successive governments. But as I understand it, the investor understands completely New Zealand's position, which we won't be allowing the export of live sheep for slaughter, and that we won't be changing that position. So I think he may be disappointed, but he's comfortable with the next best alternative, which is some breeding stock to be moved. He's a very large, as I understand him, a very large investor of significant quantities of livestock. So he owns a huge amount of livestock.
So that breeding stock, the
Breeding
900
stock.
that went over is
I think it was
a way of
1,000,
sort of,
but yeah.
1,000 is
Yeah.
a way of dealing with that issue.
Yeah.
Given tariffs aren't high, presumably there's no sensitive industries that are trying to protect land. So did you get no indication of why they would want this?
Well, if you look at the history of what's been happening there, the Gulf states have been getting almost to the finishing line with quite a number of countries. I think it was last year that they finally ratified with Singapore. So they've definitely taken that next step. And the impression we got from all of them is New Zealand's the next cab off the rank. And we pushed as hard as we practically could with the Saudis. I mean, the others were effusive in their praise of why it should happen. The Saudis were a little more guarded, but I wouldn't take that as negative. I just think this is a slightly culturally and very different way of dealing with it.
Just another question on the minister's brother. Are you kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place here? Obviously, you can't stand the minister down now because in doing so you break suppression.
Because of the last bit, sorry?
Because in doing so you'd essentially break suppression by revealing who the minister is.
Well, I'm not going to go through all of the rationale and advice that was provided to me, but I can just tell you that we were presented with the issue on the 1st of April. We sought advice straight away. The advice was very clear, and the advice was very thorough. And for all of those reasons, I'm very confident in the position we're taking.
Would you
So
say
you
the
won't
minister
sit-
down if suppression wasn't in place?
No, I wouldn't.
Was that a consideration in your decision, name suppression, and whether or not naming the minister or sending the minister down could?
Well, that could be a factor, but there are many factors, and all I can tell you is it's I would describe as strongly worded advice.
But that was part of the consideration and not.
Well,
sending
there are
the minister down.
many factors.
And that was one of the
I wouldn't really
factors.
want to pull too many out of it.
But that was one of the factors.
We'll have to wait and see one day.
Were you told as soon as this became an issue, or was there a delay at all? Or?
I was told as soon as the minister was aware of it.
And that was how long ago? 3
1st of
months?
April.
If there isn't a suppression granted and this does become public, will you look at standing the minister down?
No, the advice is not to stand the minister down. Okay.